Hello everyone, this is Al-Fadi and I want to welcome you back to another video of our new series on the search for Muhammad. We've been talking about some of the problems that are basically being uncovered, which contradict the traditional historical information that we have about Muhammad, for instance, or Mecca, or even other things related to the origin of Islam. Today we're going to continue along this line, and we're going to take a look at two important parts of the history of Muhammad. One, for instance, has to do with the so-called the HIJRA, where the Islamic calendar basically started it when supposedly Muhammad and Abu Bakr left Mecca because they were being persecuted and there was a threat to assassinate him, and left at night, left his cousin Ali in bed, and went to a cave, and and a spider basically covered that cave and protected them, and that's why we have a chapter on a spider. But nevertheless, Muhammad ended up basically going to Medina, and that started what we call the Islamic calendar. In fact, if you want to look at the Islamic date is totally different. It's 1400 plus. Why? Because that basically commemorate the date when Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina. And then we're going to look about another thing that has to do with the name Mecca itself. So I'm going to let, of course, no other than Dr. J. Smith to unpack these two problems for us. Dr. J, thank you again for being here with us.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you so much.
What's going on with the Hijra and also Mecca?
Okay, well, here we got, and this is fascinating because when we talk about the Hijra, we're talking about the Abbasid view of the Hijra versus what really did happen in 622. By the time the Abbasids finally write this down, they have a whole different narrative than what actually did happen in 622. Now, you know what happened in 622. In 622 is when Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, comes and destroys the Sassanians, who had been the oppressors of the Arabs, mostly all Christians, and of course, some of them are Persian, but they are mostly the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids. These are the people that were under the oppression of the Sassanids, and that's why when Heraclius destroys them, he destroys this oppression. That became a huge year, and that's when haven't got to him yet, but Ilyas ibn Qabisa comes into the picture, because he is the one that actually changes his allegiance and actually supports then the Arabs. And that's when you see what's happening in the 7th century. But that's not the story we get by the 9th and 10th century, 200 to 300 years later. This story has this Muhammad that they have now created as their prophet to give that identity in the prophetic line. This is when he's moved from a city called Mecca to Medina. And of course, they point to that event. In chapter 2, looking at this same idea. But let's go back and let's go to the slide and let's start bringing this up. So let's open the slide, and there you have the first reference. Now, it's fascinating. You don't have any reference to the Hijra, which means movement. It means like an exodus, doesn't it?
Right.
The word itself.
That's where you get the word muhajirin or muhajirun.
People of the Hijra.
Exactly.
Un means plural, masculine.
Migrated. Yeah.
They migrated. The people who were migrated, which is fascinating because the muhajirun is a reference to the 7th century. The Arabs would call them some muhajirun, and these would be nomadic people, the people who are always moving from place to place to place. The muhajirun, the people who are moving. That word then is now implied and it's first written down by Ibn Ishaq. Hold on a minute. Didn't we just talk about Ibn Ishaq earlier?
Yep.
How do we know that Ibn Ishaq wrote this down?
Well, I mean, we
found
out that Ibn Ishaq wrote it later.
We have nothing about Ibn Ishaq. So actually, it's Ibn Hisham that actually writes this down. It is Ibn Hisham who then introduces this in the 833. That's the 9th century. Let's go back to the slide again. So Ibn Hisham has to rewrite what he says was written by Ibn Ishaq. Obviously, this is now the narrative that the Abbasids want you to believe. During the Abbasid era. Remember, I said over and over again in these episodes, we're going to come to the Abbasid era because the Abbasids really have a narrative that is different than that which precedes. And this happens, listen, this is nothing new. This happens all the time. You have two different groups of people that are at war with each other. They hate each other. Finally, one has ascendancy over the other, and that person then, the ones who have ascendancy then they usually create their own capital. Well, isn't it interesting? The Abbasids they don't want to live in Damascus. They're from the Persian background. They want to live in what used to be Ctesiphon, then becomes Baghdad. and they introduce Baghdad as their capital. Now, this is given its name in the 9th century. Nonetheless, they now bring their capital down to Iraq. Not Syria, it's now Iraq. But they absolutely hate everything that has happened because for 100 years they've been under the oppression of these Umayyads living up there in Damascus. So what do? Well, they eradicate, they destroy all the stories that aggrandize the Umayyads, and they introduce their own story. That's why Ibn Ishaq then starts to introduce their own prophet. And he's the one that first write that down, but we don't have Ibn Ishaq, we only have Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham finally writes the credentialized story, the narrative that has become the official narrative. Later on, another 40 years, then you get the traditions concerning the sayings of the prophet. 600,000 of these sayings are whittled down to 7,397. 98% are thrown out, only 2 are returned by al-Bukhari. What happened to those 98%? I would love to be able to read them because I think an awful lot of those 98% include all these original stories from the Umayyad period, which is really probably what say an awful lot about Ilyas ibn Qabisa. We're going to get to that when we get to Ibn Qabisa because al-Bukhari does mention him, though it's a deformation of his name. Let's get back now to the Hijra. Let's go back to the slide again. They're hated by the Abbasids. They eradicate the history of the Umayyads, and they include their own history, their own references to these battles. That's the battles you see al-Waqidi is introducing. Now, what's fascinating, they introduce a lot of their new stories surrounding their prophet Muhammad, including this story of 622. Because they need this to give him a handle for himself in the 7th century. But instead of referring to the defeat of the Persians by the Byzantines, they don't want that part in there. What do? They create a new narrative around Muhammad of having him move from one city to the other instead. That fits now, suddenly, this character moving out. Murad was really good. Murad, the guy from Middle East, he speaks and he reads Arabic and Aramaic, and he's going back and he's saying, take a look, and you will see that when you look at all these traditions that are in the Quran, if you look at these traditions, have you noticed that they all take they take an awful lot of the same stories, the biblical prophets, and they apply it to Muhammad. So a lot of things that happened to him.
There's an interesting one you're going to allude to right now, and I'll elaborate further when you mention it.
Go ahead.
Yes, about the entry, the triumphant entry of Muhammad into Medina.
So who do you think that is actually modeled on?
Well, of course, Jesus entered into Jerusalem, and I tell you why. It dawned on me when I realized that they were using basically palm, branches. Technically speaking, that's exactly what happened when Jesus entered into Jerusalem.
So if you are trying to recreate in your prophet many of the things that have come from before, from the other prophets, and you want him to be the seal of the prophets, you want him to be the greatest of all prophets, don't you take these stories that you have borrowed already in the Quran, they're already in the Quran, and you then take the same stories and you aggrandize it and apply it to your own prophet, including this example of him coming into Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Much the same thing, these palm fronds.
And they were singing, saying, Tala al-Badru alayna, meaning the moon has just appeared, or the light has just appeared, and they changed the name of the city from Yathrib to Medina. Al-Madina al-Munawwara, meaning the city of light.
The city of light. There you go. So you can see there is a concerted effort. There is a concerted effort to get their own narrative. So the biography follows similar stories taken in the Bible of the biblical prophets and transfer them onto Muhammad, especially those of Moses, including the ones of his persecution, followed by an Exodus. There's the Exodus. They want the same thing that Moses had, and then entering Medina. In this case, they're now taking that which happened to Jesus in Jerusalem. This is symptomatic of what you do when you now become the leader. When you become and you now are the new men on the block, the new culture. You need to introduce and aggrandize yourselves and, of course, your man in your book.